Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Melody Brown-Berkins. I'm the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies in the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, where I'm also a senior associate director. And before I begin, I did want to make a special note, and actually I'll thank, I don't know if she's here, Professor Lydia Jennings, an environmental soil scientist and citizen of the Pasquayaqui tribe and Huichol, and a new colleague in our environmental studies department, who signs her emails with land acknowledgement that I'd like to just make before we begin, that Dartmouth is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Abenaki peoples and their non-human relations. Dartmouth College was founded as a Moors Indian charity school and today has the responsibility to serve Indigenous peoples of the past, present, and future. Thank you, Dr. Jennings. It is with great pleasure that I introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kathy Snow, a distinguished scholar and educator whose work has significantly advanced our understanding of knowledge co-production, working to co-develop research with community partners in the Arctic and around the world, with a focus most recently on Inuit teacher education and Inuit student success, persistence and wellness, and resilience. Many of her friends, colleagues, and knowledge co-production partners are likely online with us today, so thank you for being here. And Dr. Snow has let me know that she looks forward to an interactive engagement with you during her lecture, with both folks here and online, so I will do my best to facilitate that seamlessly. Stay tuned. And let me begin by just saying what a pleasure it has been to have the aptly named Dr. Snow with us here during our winter term at Dartmouth. I first met Dr. Snow through Zoom as she considered applying to Dartmouth College for the Canada Fulbright Research Chair in Arctic Studies, which we host every year, and we immediately fell into wonderful conversations. Those conversations continued on a long walk in Bodø, Norway, at the 2024 Arctic Congress last summer, where we covered, I think, a good few kilometers. We did. Just talking with a random walk and a random talk about education, our Arctic colleagues, and her upcoming visit here. Since arriving, Dr. Snow has made herself an invaluable part of our community, including engagements with the Intercultural Learning Group led by my colleague, Dr. Casey Aldrich, another associate director at the Dickey Center, as well as meetings with students and faculty across campus. To let you know a bit about her professional experience, Dr. Snow is a professor within the Faculty of Education at the University of Prince Edward Island. Her academic journey is as diverse as it is distinguished. She completed her undergrad studies with a Bachelor's of Education and a Bachelor of Science at the University of Prince Edward Island. She furthered her education by earning a Master of Arts in Teaching and Learning from the University of Bath in England. Her professional experience then spanned various educational roles, including positions as a K-12 educator and administrator, both in Canada and internationally. And her research portfolio is both extensive and eclectic, unified by her exploration of issues related to the organization of schools and school systems for student well-being. As a former science and technology educator and having grown up in Nunavut, her research is deeply rooted in the understanding of place, land-based education, and systemic injustices. In recognition of all these contributions and educational research and knowledge co-production around the world, Dr. Snow was appointed our 2025 Distinguished Canada Fulbright Research Chair in Arctic Studies at Dartmouth last fall. I want to say the Canada Fulbright Research Chair in Arctic Studies at Dartmouth is a prestigious academic position that fosters collaboration between Canadian scholars and the Institute of Arctic Studies in the Dickey Center here at Dartmouth. This distinguished chair each year supports interdisciplinary research on pressing Arctic issues, from climate change and Indigenous governance to education and sustainable development. And though we had some scheduling challenges to have them join us here today, one of the greatest supporters of the Canada Fulbright Research Chair at Dartmouth has long been the Office of the Canada's Consul General of New England, currently led by the Honorable Bernadette Jordan. Consul General Jordan kindly sent us a short welcome for Dr. Snow that reiterates the importance of our U.S.-Canada relationships and partnerships with and for Arctic Indigenous peoples, and I will play that now before I just quickly introduce Kathy's lecture. See if this works.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bernadette Jordan, and I'm Canada's Consul General to New England. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but I was grateful for the invitation to offer some opening remarks. I'm speaking to you from my office, which is situated on the traditional lands of the Massachusetts people. We honor and acknowledge the presence of Indigenous peoples, past and present, in shaping the land that we now call Boston. My thanks first go to Dr. Melody Birkins, the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and the Institute of Arctic Studies for this invitation. I was delighted to join you last year, and I really wish I could have been there with you again this year. We're so grateful for the partnership with Dartmouth and for the priority you give each year to the Canada Fulbright Research Chair program for Arctic Studies. It's been a difficult period for the US and Canada, but I'm confident that we will get through this working together. I just recently celebrated 1 year as Canada's Consul General in New England, and I'm reminded regularly how fortunate I am to be posted in this region. New Englanders understand the importance of the strong US-Canada relationship, and academic partnerships like this exemplify the best aspects of this strong partnership. The Arctic is an area where collaboration and partnership with our US allies is essential to the maintenance of a secure, strong, and well-defended North American homeland. Canada recently announced its new Arctic foreign policy, a comprehensive diplomatic policy for Canada's engagement in and on the Arctic. The AFP is comprised of 4 foreign policy pillars, including the adoption of a more inclusive approach to Arctic diplomacy, and was developed through months of meaningful conversations with Indigenous peoples. Among the commitments detailed in this policy, Canada intends to uphold the role of the Arctic and Northern Indigenous people as active partners in the conduct of international relations in the Arctic and to support their efforts to advance this goal. We're increasing representation of Indigenous peoples at Global Affairs Canada, with sustained efforts to boost recruitment and retention, including a paid Arctic and Northern Indigenous youth internship program. We will continue to support equitable research partnerships at the international level between Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers. These are just a few examples, and I encourage each of you to read about Canada's new Arctic foreign policy and the commitments that we have made for true partnerships with Indigenous peoples in the Arctic. Now you're all in for a wonderful discussion with Dr. Kathy Snow. Allow me to extend a warm virtual welcome to New England to Dr. Snow, and I'm sorry I'm not able to be there today to listen to your talk. The development of women leaders has been a passion of mine, not only in my career but also throughout my whole life. As Canada's first Minister for Rural Economic Development, I had the honor and privilege of meeting women leaders across Canada, including in the North. Dr. Snow's work on women leadership development in the Arctic is essential for women in Canada from coast to coast to coast. I know Dartmouth has been fortunate for the last 3 years to host fabulous women leaders as part of the Canada Fulbright program, and I have no doubt that Dr. Snow will be part of this great tradition. Many thanks again for the invitation to speak with you, and my congratulations to Dr. Snow on your research chair and on your work. Thank you.
My thanks again to Canada Fulbright, to Consul General Jordan, and to everyone here at Dartmouth who have welcomed Dr. Snow here today. Her lecture, as you see, is entitled Navigating Identity and Power, Inuit Educators and the Future of Arctic Women's Leadership Development. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished 2025 Canada Fulbright Research Chair in Arctic Studies, Dr. Kathy Snow.
So thank you, Melody, and I am so sort of grateful and thankful to be here today, sponsored by Fulbright and welcomed by the Institute of Arctic Studies. And I have to say, I have felt nothing but welcome since arriving here, and I think it's important to acknowledge that today. So in the language of Nunavut, Ulakut, welcome, Kwe, welcome. Thank you all for coming here today. I want to start, though, first by saying if you've come here to find answers, you will leave a little bit disappointed because I have none. But what I do hope is to open up a conversation with all of you about issues related to identity and power in the workplace. I'm seating it in the conversation of educational leadership, but when you sort of listen, I think there'll be pieces that will resonate with all of you in different ways in different spaces. And so that's why part of this conversation I hope will be interactive. I've created a few spaces where I'll pause and I'll sort of ask you to share some of your thoughts and ideas about the things that are shared. And for those of you online, I can't see you so that you know, but I do have helpers. And you'll see across the bottom of Zoom a small button that says Q&A. And that is for you to sort of post your chat. They can be comments, they don't have to be questions, but you just shoot those out there, and my helpers here will draw attention, read them out to the to the group that's here in the room, and then you'll be able to be part of that conversation as well. So with that, I'll sort of begin. Again, the conversation this evening will start with a little bit of an introduction to Inuit Nunangat. I wasn't sure how many people were familiar. Then I'm going to talk about what brought me, a very small white girl, to this conversation. Talk about some of the critical assumptions that I brought to the work, what I heard when I started doing the work, and then some final invitations to discuss. What you'll see here in the photos on the side is my second home in Iqaluit. The top picture is my elementary school. Who thought it would be a wise idea to build an elementary school without windows in Nunavut? I'm not quite sure. But this is an example, okay? And then what you'll see in the bottom photo is sort of the larger portion of the town. And that high-rise building is actually part of a complex that was built as part of the Distance Early Warning Station. And so this was actually American military houses. And so I grew up in abandoned military housing. So yeah, I just thought it's interesting connections, right? So what is Inuit Nunangat? Inuit Nunangat is the territory, the traditional territory of the Inuit peoples of Canada. And it's located across the entire sort of upper Arctic region of Canada, and it's divided into 4 separate regions. The largest being Nunavut, which is sort of the central Arctic in light blue. And then to the west, we have Inuvialuit, which is the Inuit territory which resides within the Northwest Territories, which is comprised of Inuit and First Nations peoples. To the east, you'll see Nunavik, which is also considered part of northern Quebec. And then we have Nunatsiavut, the most recently recognized land claims territory, which is only sort of became recognized in 2009, and they are part of, or 2005, sorry, and they are part of Newfoundland and Labrador. So you see, the Inuit territories have complex governance systems because some of them are standalone territories, some of them fall underneath other territories, and some of them fall underneath provincial jurisdictions. In terms of size and scale, I sort of share the next photo, which is Nunavut, which is the Central Arctic. And my hometown, I'm told this works, is Baker Lake, which was here. And then I later moved to Iqaluit. So this is sort of where I started my beginnings. But to get an idea of size and scale of what Nunavut looks like, I pulled out another picture. I'm assuming people know how big California is. So you can compare sort of California to Baffin Island, and you can see that we're talking about a vast expanse of land with a very small number of people. I looked it up the other day and found out that the only smaller population density found on the planet is Antarctica. And so we're sort of a close second in Nunavut. And so this also sort of plays into some of the kinds of conversations that we have when we talk about infrastructure and development. Melody mentioned that we had been in Norway together. And I'm always sort of shocked when I travel to other Nordic regions. When you look at how much infrastructure is there, there are roads that connect towns. That is not what we have in Nunavut. So most of the communities you see here are fly in, fly out. Some of them have ice roads in the wintertime. But otherwise, you have very small communities that are very widely separated from each other. And so the community of Baker Lake that I grew up in had a population when I was there of about 200 to 300 people. I think now it's up to 500. Iqaluit was a population of about 3,000. I think now, since it has become the capital, is about 10,000. Okay, and that would be the largest community that you would find. Okay, and so how did I come to be there? The top photo, this is my mom. So my mother graduated from a one-room schoolhouse in Prince Edward Island. She had the option after her sort of one-year teacher degree to either go to teach at the brand new consolidated school where her youngest brother would be, or go up north. So she chose adventure, and you can see sort of the type of lifestyle that she went to. This is us on the airport, sitting on the fuel drums that are going to be used to fuel the plane that we're going to use to sort of fly in and out of community. And I think a lot of people traveled to the north at this time. This would be late 60s, because of that sense of adventure. But that shouldn't sort of undercut what was happening in the history of Canada at that time. Canada and the Arctic was relatively ignored until about the 50s, when the government was almost forced into responsibility for the Inuit people. And so there was we want the territory, but we don't want to be responsible for what's there. And so there was a lot of complexity around that. And so part of that then began in the late 50s, settlement process. So Inuit were moved from their traditional territories into those towns I just showed you. So those were not necessarily places that people had lived before. Cambridge Bay, for example, is essentially a dust bowl, but it was considered strategically important, so people were put there. Baker Lake happened to be the winter resting ground for people in the area, and so that became then a town that people were settled to, and they were settled to with the promise of infrastructure. So my mother went up as one of the first teachers. She taught federal day school. My father went up to build the houses that people were moved into. Prior to sort of that time period of federal day, Inuit didn't necessarily participate in school, although mission schools existed. There was more flexible enrollment. By the time federal day came, if you wanted to take part in services, if you wanted medical care, you had to send your kids to school. So one of my mother's contemporaries, McMallan, I listened to him sort of tell a story about, very well-intentioned, trying to encourage a young boy that he knew was in his class, but he saw, as he looked out of the window, sort of wandering off to go hunting. He left his class for a few minutes. He chased the child down and tried to pull that boy back into school, thinking like he needs to come. It will be good for him that, to come to school. This is what he needs to do. And he ended up having like a bit of a fisticuff with the child, and the child got away and ran away. And then sort of reflecting back on this years later, he said, well, I know why the child won, because he was fighting for something much more important than I was. He was fighting for his freedom. And so this is the climate that I grew up in, all right? And there you see little me living in community. My parents were very busy, so I was raised in community and accepted as a community member. Many teachers at that time, and many Southerners at that time, would come north. They might last a year or two. In fact, the federal government instituted a policy that teachers, when sent to community, had to be sent in twos, because usually one of them would quit within about 6 months, and so then they wouldn't have one. So they'd be short. So there's even stories of people arriving in community, looking around at what they were going to see and not getting off the plane, refusing to leave the plane and being sent back because they weren't prepared for the type of situation that they were going to be in. My parents ended up spending their entire working career in the north, and so I grew up in the Arctic. And in this photo, I'm wearing a very traditional dress. This is an amautic. It's a coat used with a very large hood to keep your baby in, and so you carry your baby in this way. And so it was given to me to play, right? So I'm playing with my amautic, and it's a very, very traditional Baker Lake style. And fast forward a little bit from small community Baker Lake, about 300 people, very much part of the community. Very, very few non-Inuit in community. So I was very much a minority, to Iqaluit, the soon-to-be capital of Nunavut, which was only an hour away from Montreal and had a much more diverse population of French, English, and Inuit. And this photo I think is the beginning of me and my anger towards what is happening. And so the story of this photo is a Christmas concert. I am in, I think grade 6. in their wisdom, the teacher decided for Christmas concert that she would have all of us do the Mexican hat dance. We made Mexican outfits out of paper, and we performed this. And because I was tall, I was told to be a boy. And so I was both angry at being forced to do the Mexican hat dance in Iqaluit. I was also angry because I was forced to be a boy. And so you can see me, and in my resistance, I put on my kamik, because once we moved to the larger city, people didn't wear traditional clothes as much. And so I was really angry. And so I put on my kamik, and I stomped around doing the Mexican hat dance and really thinking, this isn't right. This isn't right what's happening in schools. And I think that's the first time I really became aware of it, and just so happened that my parents captured that photo. And so this is the beginning of my thoughts about, well, what is happening in education in the North. And so I think Senator Sinclair has said it the best when talking about the period of residential and federal day schools, is that it's education that's put us in this mess, and it's education that's going to get out of that. And I take that very, very much to heart. So all of my work around change and reconciliation is seated in education. And it starts not with, what is Kathy's plan, but it starts with what is the Inuit plan. So what are the goals of Inuit around education? In 2011, currently Governor General, then ITK President Mary Simon, developed in collaboration with communities the Inuit National Strategy on Education. It's also titled First Canadians, Canadians First, and I've shared that sharing that is important to me because that could be misconstrued. First Canadians, Canadians First. And so what does that title actually mean? And the title comes from a conversation that was held with an elder early in the process. The elder was asked, do you see yourself as a Canadian? Or do you see yourself as an Inuit in Canada? And his answer is both. I am both. And so where sometimes you see these sort of slogans of, first Canadians, Canadians first, it sounds divisive, but it's actually meant to be a unifying concept. And so this strategy for education was also meant to be a unifying concept. How can we work together to better the situation for Inuit youth in Canada? And what the national strategy pointed to was 3 critical pieces: supporting children to stay in school, providing bilingual curriculum, and development of cultural sort of values, history, and worldview in schools, and also increasing the number of educational leaders and bilingual educators in schools. Okay, I started with problem number 1, or challenge number 1. Shortly thereafter, shortly after the national strategy was released, ITK developed the Inuit National Center for Inuit Education, and their mandate was to enact the national strategy. And I partnered with them to look at that first issue. How do you support children to stay in school? And I came into that work with my own assumptions, right? I came in with the assumption that people want to go to school, right? That you want to go to school because you have these goals. And I'll just pause for a second. Think about if I asked you, what are your goals for school? What are your goals for your children in school? What are the goals for the young people around you in school? Right? Just think, you don't have to share, just think about that for a second. When I asked myself that question, I came up with very, very white girl answers, right? I think it's important to go to school so that you can better yourself, so that you can get to the career that you want to get to. School provides a stepping stone to open the world for you, right? These are the things that I thought about, and I thought, so in looking at that issue and asking communities, so what I did is I conducted case studies across Inuit Nunangat, and I spoke to probably about 30 to 40 people in each region, so several hundred people, and I asked them that, is what do you want for your children in school? right? Because if people aren't sending their children to school, if people don't want to go to school, then the school's not doing something, right? So I asked, well, what is it that you want for your children in school? And the first thing they said, which is probably the most obvious answer, but it didn't come to me right away until I heard them say it, was, I want school to reinforce the language and cultural identity of Inuit. I want my children to go to school, to feel healthy, to feel happy, and be able to become contributors to the community, right? And I sort of stopped there, thought, okay, right? Because as much as I had grown up in Nunavut, as much as I thought I understood, all of a sudden I had a moment, I had no idea, right? Because for me, school reflected my culture. School reflected my identity. School reflected my language. So none of those things were things I ever really thought about having to deliberately fight for, despite what I just talked about, having stomped around, being angry that we had been asked to do this thing. It really hit home there. So if you want this, if this is your goal, how do you get there in education? And that really pointed to the educators, right? Just like when my mother started teaching, today, the majority of teachers in Inuit Nunangat are not Inuit, okay? Furthermore, there are even fewer principals and leaders, right? So the further you go up into the administration of what is currently Inuit government, those that are in the power to construct and set up the schools are not necessarily Inuit. If you look at the stats here, we have about 28% of the teachers in Nunavut are Inuit, with a student population of, 96% Inuit, right? So children in schools don't have people that look like them and that have the same backgrounds as them. Furthermore, of those 28%, the majority of them are found in early elementary. So they'll be in kindergarten to grade 3. After that, the children sort of progressively, as they go through school, lose role models, right? When you can find Inuit in leadership, though, and part of the issue, right? This is my second assumption that was proven to be wrong. Was that in order to become a leader in Nunavut, in most of the regions, if you want to be a principal, you have to have a master's degree, right? And so what has also happened is those with master's degrees end up leaving schools, right? So there's almost a brain drain of the schools because people with master's degrees go on to other professions, so they leave schools. So that became the second challenge. Why are people leaving schools? Why aren't Inuit going into teaching? Jobs are not easy to come by in Inuit Nunangat. And so here is a job that allows you to live in community, earn a good salary, and do good. So why don't people want that job, right? Why is nobody going into that? And so that's the question I have for you. What do you think? Why aren't people entering teaching and leadership in Inuit Nunangat? Here, I do want to hear some answers. Yeah.
We'll get to it quickly. This way the folks online can hear you too.
Maybe because it's very expensive and time-consuming to go to university and then get a teacher's license on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're teaching and leading in an environment that doesn't align with your goals and values.
Yeah, I wonder if it has to do with established community there for educators and whether or not there's like enough community infrastructure there for educators to feel supported.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether the teacher training leading into the teaching profession is nuanced and culturally sensitive enough to produce the teachers you need for that environment.
Yeah, thank you. The answer is you're all right, and it's complicated, right? If it was an easy fix, then it would be fixed by now, because this has been something that people have been working for what, 30, 40 years? In fact, the reason why we moved from Baker Lake to Iqaluit is because my mother changed from teaching in school and leading in school to the Eastern Arctic Teacher Education Program, which was a groundbreaking new program for Inuit to offer an Inuit-centric education degree. However, fast forward, they're still not there, right? My first thought was the same thought we heard here, is it's really hard maybe to get that credential, right? And to access that education degree. And I won't say that it's easy to do, but those pathways are there, right? If you look in each one of the regions, Nunavut has an in-house teacher training program that brings community members into the schools to obtain their teaching degree while working. In Nunavut, there's the NAC, the Nunavut Arctic College, offers community-based teacher education program that's been around since the Eastern Arctic Teacher Education Program in the 80s. Inuvialuit was one of the smaller regions. They used to partner with Aurora College, but that program is currently paused. So here is like, okay, here's an access issue, right? Nunatsiavut recently offered a community-based Inuit-specific teacher training partnership. Nunatsiavut is also a very small community, or a small region. That program is currently paused, but it's paused because there were no people left to join it. So I sit there, if there are folks from MUN out here, they might correct me, but I suspect that one will come back again in a few years. It'll be something that will be on their rotation. So the access is there, right? And then also when we looked at further to leadership, because my first assumption is that that master's degree is gatekeeping. People can't get in because of the master's degree. That was not really complete, because in Inuvialuit and Nunatsiavut, they sort of waive those requirements, and aspiring leaders are encouraged to engage in leadership training, shadowing, working with others, and supported through obtaining a master's degree. There's formal programs within Nunavut and Nunavik for the development of leadership through co-teaching, co-principalships. So those spaces exist, right? So it's not a matter of, you'll see my age, of the Kevin Costner Field of Dreams movie, build it and they will come, because it's built, but they're not coming. So there's something a little bit bigger than that, right? And the bigger than that has to do with exactly what Francine is talking about, is values. So when people think about their experience both as students in schools within Inuit Nunangat, as teachers in schools, and as students in teacher education programs both in Inuit Nunangat and outside of, they're confronted with very different worldviews. So Inuit Kayuma Tukangit is what is sort of considered the Inuit epistemology. This is what the Inuit believe to be true, and things that have always been believed to be true. It's their societal values, right? And it starts with respecting others in relationships and caring for one another, serving to support your family and your community, developing skills through mentoring, observation, and practice and effort. Can't see which one's on the end. Thank you. Fostering good spirits, being inclusive, decision-making through discussion and consensus, being innovative and resourceful, and finally, having a respectful relationship with the land, living and non-living creatures that are in it. And if you look at this, 6 of those 8 are all foundationally seated in relationship building, right? And having good relationships and mapping ways of having good relations. How does that contrast with school experience, right? As a Canadian, I tried to think of, well, how would I describe what my societal values are, right? Or those that sort of drive what happens in schools. And this was probably the best thing and the closest thing I could find, which was essentially the British values, right? So the rule of law is important. We respect the rule of law, tolerance for others, mutual respect, democracy, and individual liberties, right? These are huge contentious points because they're so, although they could be similar and they have similar words, perhaps similar understanding, the nuancing is really important. Tolerance versus welcoming and inclusion, right? It's very different to be tolerated than it is to be welcomed and included. Some of the most violent things I have experienced in terms of arguments had to do with the democratic process as opposed to consensus building. The rule of law, right? How many of you have traveled to the airport and been told, oh yeah, no, I can't change your flight because the system doesn't let me do that, right? And been frustrated by that small thing. Imagine if the rule of law tells you that your children aren't allowed to speak their language. If the rule of law has removed your ability to provide for your family because the RCMP, the National Police Force, has come in and killed all of your hunting dogs, right? So imagine if the rule of law has told you that you have to live here and not wherever you want to live, right? So that history is certainly there, and those understandings, right? One of the elders I spoke to talked to me and told me that she said, you know, I learned how to lie in residential school. Prior to that, I never needed to. It was not something that they had even thought about. But because the rule of law really didn't align with working together for a common goal, that's what people felt that they were forced to do. And the same thing can be said of mutual respect and relationship building, right? I can respect you but not have a relationship with you. And that makes for a very different kind of conversation and negotiation. And the place that you seat yourself, right? The importance of individual liberty, right? Me, myself, and I am going forward, as opposed to I am part of a very interconnected web of people that have to work together in order for us to thrive, right? So all of these things come up. And all of these things did come up then when I conducted a second round of case studies, interviewing again another 20 to 40 people in each of the regions, and asking, well, you know, what brought you into teaching? Why do you stay? And would you consider leadership, and why not, right? Because again, in my assumption is like, well, it's the natural progression of things. You become a teacher, then you become a principal, and then you become, because that's what you do, right? And I was very surprised by the answers that I received, but not when I listened to the why, right, and looked at this. So the rest of this presentation is going to share some of those little snippets of conversations, and I apologize because there's going to be a lot of text up here because I wanted to have the actual words here, but I'll tell you what they said, or I'll tell you about the conversation so you don't have to read it, but if you want to, it's there, okay. So the first thing, in relation to being innovative and resourceful, this really has to do with the pathway. The Inuit region with the most amount of Inuit educators is Nunavik. Okay? It still falls short of targets, but they have the largest proportion of Inuit educators in the territory. And why? Because they have been innovative. A lot of school system is gatekeeping, right? You need this credential, you need this space, you need to do this. And so you walk through these specific competitive processes in order to sort of be the best to achieve the thing that you need. Nunavik has turned that upside down. Within their schools, within their communities, when they see somebody has talent and interest, they will recruit them through shoulder tapping directly out of high school. They will find educators all over the place. Two of the educators I spoke to had started working in the schools as custodians, so caretakers of the school. They were recognized as having special talents, and then they were brought into this into the different roles in the school and mentored and supported and trained through that. Elders often face challenges in entering the schools when we think about, oh, schools work with minors, you need to have a criminal records check, you need to... They've accepted that the school is part of the community, and then elders are brought into the school as part of that community and supported to be able to teach what they know in traditional ways. They have laddering systems in place. So educational technologists are people that have come into teaching through a certificate process where they work with students with additional needs. And so they sort of shadow those students and work in the schools. And so again, they saw those people in the school and said, okay, we need you. You're doing a great job. You be a teacher too. And so they're laddered into the education program. But they also bring everyone they can into teaching, support them through co-teaching, shadowing, and working on their B.Ed while being employed and able to stay in their community, right? So they're not asked to ship out. And they're not asked to give up different things in order to be able to work in the school, okay? So it's a rethinking, right? Because when we think about teacher education in the South, you get your first degree, then you get your second degree, usually involves big blocks of time. In Canada, at least, I don't know about the US, I probably should have looked that up. But all B.Ed programs are in-person programs. You can't even do them as a distance. You have to be there because it's considered experiential. But apparently, it's experiential at the university, not at the community school. So they've offered this beautiful space to rethink what teacher education looks like. And that's why they have more educators. Thinking about the family and family commitments and service to community. One of the teachers that I talked to in Inuit, so in Inuit, that's where the program's paused. It's been paused for a little while. There, if you want to be a teacher, you have to leave community. And so one of the women I spoke to told me a story about when she went south to do her BEd. So she was talking with her husband, and her husband was like, you can't go. Who's going to take care of the kids? How are we going to manage on just one salary? You're going to be gone for this very long time. And they had a bit of a heated argument about it. And so she said very adamantly, listen, you let me do this. I promise you it's going to be worth it for all of us. When I come home and get a job, I'm going to give you my paycheck. And you'll see how much that sacrifice is worth it for all of it. And so, they came to terms. He completely forgot about that conversation. She did her B.Ed. She came back. She found out that her school used direct deposit. And so all she had was a pay stub. And so when she came back with her first pay stub, she apologized to her husband and said, I'm so sorry. I really, really wanted to give you the check so you could see that. But all I have is a pay stub. And he looked at it and he was like, that's for 2 weeks? And she said, yes. And he said, wow, you were right. And she said, listen, thank you for trusting me. I work for you. I work for my kids. That always makes me a bit emotional. And take a sec. And it's been like that ever since. So she's continued working in her school, and now she works for her grandchildren. And so you see sort of these deep, deep, deep-seated connections to family that get disrupted by the education program. With respect to looking at relationships and caring for people, speaking to another Inuit teacher, they spoke very much. This was an older educator, and she spoke about the toll that attending residential school had taken on her self-esteem. She felt like she had nothing left to offer because so much of her culture had been stripped from her, so much of her language had been stripped from her. She felt like she couldn't have that relationship with school. So she actually came into schools in Inuit working as an educational assistant. And that gave her space and time to see what schools were like, to see what it was like to work with young people. She was mentored by other teachers in the school, and that's what made her decide to become a teacher. Because she saw that she could heal, and then she could look at what that space then had to offer and how she could contribute to it. In another example, from Nunavut, there was a teacher who had been the daughter of a teacher. So she had traveled to teacher training with her mother. She had a long sort of personal history of shadowing education. But she left school early to raise her family. She was working in the grocery store and kind of thought, well, that's it for me. I blew it, right? That's as far as I'm going to get. And one of her former teachers came to her and saw her in the grocery store and said, listen, you can do a lot more than this. And mentored her and encouraged her to go back to school and to go back into teaching. And so she did. And she started the same way as an in-class assistant. Because you think about that, observe, practice, try, observe, practice, try, right? And so it gave space for that. But it wasn't possible without that shoulder tapping. People needed to know that they were important and that they were wanted and that they were part of the community. The next one was talking about sort of being inclusive and fostering good space. And this one broke my heart when I talked with this. This was a very young teacher. So she had just completed her Bachelor of Education program. And again, in Inuit, so she had to go south to do this. And so a typical Bachelor of Education program involves your coursework, and then you go and you do sort of practical placements in schools, and then you do some more coursework, and then some more practical placements, and then you're kind of done. And what was happening with her is they allowed her to do her practical placements at home in her home community, so she didn't have to stay in the South to do that, which was great. And it was, I think, a 4-year program. And what also happened in Inuit is in that community, when they saw that she was engaged in her BEd, every time she would come home, because the school said that the university school timetable is different from the K-12 timetable, every time she was home, they would say, come to the school, work in the school, even though it's not your practicum, just come and work. And they welcomed her into that community. Her supervisor in the Southern University found out, said that was not okay. That's against the rules. You can't be teaching in a classroom when you don't have your teaching license. You are only allowed to be in the school when you have your practicum. And when she sort of said, no, actually in my community, this is how we do. No. They wrote very caustic letters, said that she was not suitable to be a teacher candidate, essentially tried to fail her out of the program for those behaviors. And so she actually went home, she took a break, and she brought those letters back to her community. The people in her community, this is what her colleagues, saw the letters, ripped them up, told her they were ridiculous, and said, you're ready, you're already a teacher, so just go back there and finish it. And that's what she did. So she said, okay, I went back, I finished my last 15 weeks. As soon as I got my paper, she's talking about her diploma, her certificate. As soon as I got that, I packed up my stuff and I left because I owed them nothing. Right? So very, very alienating experience, right? Because people didn't understand that, the same rule of law doesn't apply to everyone. Right? In terms of this practice and try, okay? One of the teachers in Nunavik talked about their BEd program, and some of the complaints about the Nunavik BEd program is because it can take upwards of 10 to 12 years to obtain your BEd degree, because courses are offered sort of intermittently, but you are working the entire time that you're doing that. So there's sort of that 6 of one, half a dozen of the others. But one of the things that she said as she progressed through her BEd, the courses got more difficult and they moved further away from that experiential experience. And so she found, again, as an Inuit first language speaker, being forced into that traditional sort of role of, learning theory, reading lots of papers, responding to papers, she moved more and more away from the kind of learning experience that she wanted or felt that she needed in order to be able to become a teacher. So again, she was very disconnected from the content of what she was doing. In another example, also from Nunavik, the teacher who was a language teacher talked about her challenges with language. You have to sort of understand that although people may be considered fluent speakers, they themselves may not consider themselves fluent speakers because there's been so much decimation of language across Inuit Nunangat. People don't always necessarily feel comfortable with their mother tongue. And so she was very comfortable speaking and talking with elementary students, but there was absolutely no one available in community to be able to teach the high school students. And they said, well, you're a teacher, you know how to do this, go up with your students, move up with them, and continue that progression with them. And so she sort of thought about it, well, okay, I'm not perfect, but I'm happy I can be in this place with my students and learn with them, right? And so again, it's a very different relationship between student and teacher that one might think about. And so she was happy that she was able to work that way with those students. Working together for a common cause. This one was interesting when we talked about leadership and why they left leadership. And it had to do with sort of the bureaucracy of what is leadership. So in that position, she was in that middle point between sort of upper admin, between parents, between communities, between sort of teachers, between students. And she didn't feel like she was able to really serve people very well. And then there was such a shortage of Inuit teachers in her school, she thought, well, why am I doing this? Why am I treading water in this space when I can go back to the classroom and I can do real good, right? And so many teachers told me this. I can't leave the classroom because there's no one else, right? And so when my first assumption is, oh, they're not going into leadership because. Never in my mind did I think it was because of this, because people felt that this was the most important place they could be in order to make a difference. And see, that's my selfish white girl talking right there, because I would assume you're always going to go. But no. Okay. In Nunavut, a language teacher talked about very, very similar way. So the impetus to serve community, to support culture, to take care of children as a community responsibility was massive. So this teacher talked about teaching Inuktitut with the young children, and she said she would never, ever, ever consider leaving that space because the little ones needed her. She was really worried about language loss. She was really worried about culture loss, and she felt like she was sort of holding that space, making sure that the littlest of the little, when they came to school, would be greeted by a friendly face, be greeted by language, be greeted by culture. And she said she's going to do that job until she can't. Right, so she had no intention of ever retiring. Next, talking about the decision-making process, and again, I alluded to this a little bit. Another Nunavut teacher was talking about trying to sort of fill in that space between the upper admin, who were very supportive in words, and the trap that she felt that she was in when decisions came to the community. So she became the person who had to deliver the decisions that came from above. She said that in the end, she stopped talking. I told myself I was never going to speak again. I was not going to voice my opinion. She lost her voice in that space because of the pressures that were put on from all sides, and because it was a very top-down type of decision-making process. She felt hurt, sad, and felt that she had no support, although she recognized everybody around her was facing the same thing and trying really hard. But it was the system that didn't allow people to be able to express themselves. And then finally, in terms of relationship with the land, this is where I think the land-based and culture classes really, really come to the forefront. Because every single teacher, when I talked about what keeps you coming to work every day, why do you want to be a teacher? Why do you want to do the things that you do? And it was because of that ability to share culture and language and traditions. And the culture teachers felt that they had the best jobs in the entire school because they were allowed to teach in the way that was traditional. They could pick what they wanted to teach. They could teach it how and when they wanted. They weren't fixed by curriculum and curriculum objectives because they created those themselves. It was a very sort of naturalistic form of teaching. So the teaching followed the seasons. It followed whatever patterns were happening around. And so those were the happiest teachers I met in any of the schools. And with that, I'm going to stop. Those are the stories. Those are the stories in relation to Inuit Kayumatu I didn't want to present a conclusion because I don't want to present answers to you, but I want to open the floor now to discussion. What do you think about when you think about that, and how does that relate to your initial thoughts about why people aren't going into teaching and leadership within Inuit and Nagat? Thank you very much. Whatnot?
I'd love to open up for questions, and Sana will bring you the microphone, and online as well. I'll try to help get that done as well. Thank you for those who have put in questions already.
First of all, thank you so much for this. What a great way to put together a conversation. I love that, inviting us in. The voices that you've reflected in here that show some of the challenges that are going on don't really point to one answer. They point to different kinds of answers. Do you have a vision? Do they have a vision of what the combination, not how to get there, but what it might look like? Would everything have curriculum based on what the local interests and needs were? In other words, would it be even further away from what I think of as the westernized education? I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm just seeing what you might hear.
Yeah. Right now, there's certainly an ongoing and renewed effort. The ITK is working with communities and educational leaders on another national strategy document that will look at teacher education and what that is. So it's very messy, and all of this that I've just shared, I'm working with them again because we sort of came together in that conversation. So as I said, this isn't a Kathy question. This was a question that came from the Amaluak Education Committee, and I said, okay, listen, so I've got the capacity, I can sort of go to communities and ask those kinds of questions and gather that, and so that's what I've been working on, and so you're sort of seeing all of the early stages of these conversations that I'll be sort of sharing back, and I mean it's none of these things are rocket science. Everybody knows all of these things I've just talked about. The challenge is, how do you implement? How do you implement in a way that works for everyone? And I think the real answer to that is that it has to be different for everybody. So while you can have sort of guiding principles or ideas, right, you have to accept that context in every single community is different. And therefore, the way to run your schools is going to be different, right? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm from Toronto, so it's very nice.
Yay, Canada!
And I've talked to some people at the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, specifically teachers, and they say one of their concerns is how to maintain their languages, particularly as children get older and maybe start learning more subjects in English and going out of school. So considering that Inuktitut is one of the strongest Indigenous languages in Canada, how do you see teachers there trying to preserve the language and have kids continue speaking it and being proud of their language and things like that?
Yeah, it's really tough. You might say that Inuit is very strong, but it's not strong enough. It's not strong enough. So currently, the land claims organization, NTI for Nunavut, is actually suing the government of Nunavut. They have, I've lost the legal term for it, but it's a class action. They have a class action suit against the government of Nunavut for failing to meet their language targets and objectives that are required under the Education Act in Nunavut. And so it's a massive challenge. And you saw, like, in the beginning, sort of the second 2 points. So we started with student well-being, but the second 2 points were about bilingual education. Currently in Nunavut, for example, there is more money invested in French education than there is in Inuit education, which doesn't make sense, right? But it has to do with the advocacy and how people have addressed it. Filling the gap of Inuit educator shortage with Inuit speakers is foundational, right? And so that's the bottom. That's where you have to start, because if you don't have people that can't speak the language, then you don't have people that can teach other people how to speak the language. So that's the challenge that I think everyone is grappling with, because it's complicated. One of the other things that happens across Inuit Nunanga is when we talk about Inuit, we talk about it like it's one language, but it's actually not. There are so many different dialects of Inuit that it made resource sharing really difficult. So think about, there's the pre-pandemic time and post-pandemic time. Shortly before the pandemic, but I can't remember exactly how many years ago it was, what they did in Nunavut, at least, was they established what they called it was educational dialect. And so they and it was very controversial, because people feel very close to their own dialect, right? But they adopted educational dialect, and then they used that to work with different production companies so that they could create resources, so that teachers would have resources they could use to teach reading and to teach language and to teach everything in one standardized language, right? Because what was happening prior to the adoption of educational dialect is that every teacher was recreating and rebuilding resources. So it added to an immense workload to those teachers who were speakers, because they had to rebuild all of the resources that were used, right? Which is better than, I grew up with Dick and Jane readers in Nunavut, right? And so, it's better than that. But it was also, it made a very heavy load. So I don't think I really answered your question beyond to say, finding that standardized language has been a help, and then continued efforts in recruiting more Inuit into teaching positions.
Sorry. I don't know how things work too much in Canada, but I was curious if you have any thoughts about this newer initiative to start tribally led education programs or school systems that's kind of happening here in the US. And I only ask this because it comes from a point of kind of not working in a Western system, or getting people to work in Western built systems that are, as we've talked about, are not fully encompassing of Inuit values, and how tribally led school systems can kind of act as a way of tribal sovereignty while also leading Inuit leadership. If you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's really important. So one of the other initiatives that you've seen in Canada that's becoming more and more pressing and hopefully funded is the establishment of an Inuit university. So the Nunavut Arctic College provides some, but it still works underneath a model that's a partnership. So right now they're currently partnered with Memorial University, but they've always sort of had that beholden to or meeting the standards of these other universities. But the idea behind the Arctic University that it would be an Inuit university run and operated by Inuit. Arguably, the government of Nunavut is that, right? Because the government of Nunavut is a Inuit territory, but they still follow, in many ways, very sort of southern structures, right? And there's a lot of complexity around that, because I've spoken with some elders that say, well, because of the education that I have to decolonize myself because I've forgotten what it is, right? Some of these situations, and I find that I move into, like a meeting, and instead of sort of having a welcoming and a greeting, I get right to the agenda and Robert's Rules of Order, and then all of a sudden, then you stop and remember, right? And so yes, definitely, sort of university education for Inuit by Inuit is something that is very important. Yeah.
Thank you. This is actually a follow-on to that point, because I had the pleasure of going to the Labrador campus of Memorial University, where they have developed this really integrated teacher training program, which is kind of just amazing to me, where it's both Western and a lot of classes revolve around sort of sustainable agriculture, foraging, understanding Arctic plants, this kind of thing, like really, and taught by I think majority Inuit teachers. I'm not sure what that model is and whether it's reproducible, but it seems to me like I understand what you just said, but I'm also wondering if there isn't room for places like Memorial University or University of Toronto, whatever, McGill, to have teacher training programs in Inuit, lands that have that kind of integrated identity, and so that it's not. Because, obviously the money and the structure and all of that is coming from those southern universities, and you have to have some of that in order for these programs to develop. You can't just create them out of, I don't know, maybe the Canadian government is funding something like a Arctic college. I just don't know, but it struck me like that Memorial University Labrador campus really was kind of a success. So, I don't know.
I have to try to think of polite ways to say this. But I also say this as, UPEI, and I came to UPEI to coordinate our Certificate in Educational Leadership in Nunavut program, which was a graduate program that provided leadership and met those sort of requirements needed for folks to move into principalships, right? So we were meeting the need in community, and we also operated through co-teaching models and all sorts of things like this. Southern universities make money on programs and initiatives in Arctic regions. I think that money should stay in Arctic regions. I think it's, I'm probably going to get myself in trouble for this, but Memorial did it. They did it very well. They had a model that was built out of ages-old models. McGill also has a co-teaching model. There are lots of strengths, and I'm not saying that those programs don't work. They're responsible for a lot of what we have, and they're beautiful programs. But the funding for those programs isn't the direction you think it is. The northern communities are sending their money out to do that with very big government contracts. I personally, and I'm speaking only for myself, think it's time for that money to stay in community and provide more resources for community.
Thank you again for your talk and for your time today. Building off of a couple of the previous questions, and I apologize, this might be a little bit outside of the scope of the research that you're doing, but I was curious if the Inuit teachers who are coming home, if you felt like they were having success in shifting that curriculum or indigenizing the curriculum overall outside of the culturally based programs, where you said there was kind of the most sense of freedom. But do you get the sense that folks are having enough freedom within the context of their schools to create that pedagogy shift, or are they still kind of beholden to the cultural values that just don't match up as well?
I'm going to say absolutely. The shifts that are coming are driven by those educators. So those educators are on the front edge of, all of the work that has happened before them, right? So, but it's sort of like trying to turn, an oil tanker around on the high seas. It's slow and it's hard and it's difficult. Do those teachers come back and have doors wide open for them? Yeah, it's great. Now you have lead us and teach us. No, right? They have to fight against systemic resistance that happens. But it's certainly happening. I don't know if Ashley's online there. One of my graduate students has been working for years on an Inuit Kayuma kindergarten program. Is she there? Because I wish she could tell you about it. And she hasn't had an easy go, right? She has finally now got momentum, and they're instituting and piloting across the north, based on the work that she's done, a new model for kindergarten that is much more Inuit-centric. But it hasn't come without a lot of work. And has she typed things? Can you say what she said?
She just typed in yes, agreeing with everything.
Yeah, because Ashley is a powerhouse, but it doesn't come without a cost, right? It comes a cost of your family, your relationships, and negotiating all of the politics that is your community, and your governance system. Yeah. So good job, Ashley. And it's teachers like Ashley that will make all the difference.
I do have a question here from Sasha Nandlal. Basically, I think, if I understand it correctly, as education could be developed from the school and influence the system at the same time from the governing systems to the schools, how might you envision I think she's asking the process for all the things you're talking about. Is there a process, Nunavut-wide sort of a process to be thinking about, reapproach the teacher trainings and program development? Similar, maybe I'm thinking to what you talked about with Mary Simon in 2011. Is there a process that might be developing for this?
So the process is in development, right? And so and again, I don't think it's for me to say what that process looks like. It's a conversation that's happening with the National Inuit Committee on Education. It's a conversation that's being held in communities, that's being held across all of the regions to figure out, what that looks like. That's why I said at the beginning, I apologize, because I know I'm going to raise a lot of questions and I'm not going to have any answers at all. But you can see pieces of it. And, cliche, we're trending in the right direction, right? I always like to think that there's hope. We're moving forward, but there's a lot of pieces. Yeah.
Well, I will say thank you so much. It was an You told me you know how to do silence. That was really wonderful. She warned me, she says, I'm going to wait him out. Just watch. And you got beautiful. Thank you so much for your interaction. I didn't get to everyone online, but I tried to talk to a few of them, and you answered many of their questions as you spoke. Thank you, everyone here, for your incredible your being here and for listening so intently. And thank you for the presentation. I can't tell you how much I've just learned, even after we've spoken so many times. And thank you for being here. We have her here till April 20th.
Yeah.
So she's just upstairs in Haldeman. She's here with us for tea, for coffee, for lunches, for dinners. So I hope you'll engage with classes, etc. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Professor Snow.